So first of all, I'd just like to welcome everybody to today's webinar on ultra-processed foods towards a balanced perspective. I'm really glad to see that so many of you could make it. We've had over 650, 700 signups, so that's very exciting for us as well. It's such an important and relevant topic, so it's not surprising to see so many here. Maybe just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Jessie Doppler and I'm the coordinator of Healthy Diet, Healthy Life. I'd like to just start with a few housekeeping matters, maybe. This is just to inform you that this session will be recorded, so you can receive the recording after this webinar. We will send it out to everybody, as well as the slides and the presentations. And a quick reminder for everybody to keep their mics and videos off. I think we have it in our general settings, but just in case, I thought I'd mention it. And one reminder also for everybody just to use the question box at the bottom. If you have any questions, please pop them in there. And a reminder also to the speakers that we will be addressing the questions in the discussions part of this webinar. So there's no need to respond directly in the questions box as such. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our chair, Beatrice Morio, that's the chair of HDHL, as well as the chairs of our scientific advisory board, John Mathers, who's here today moderating this session. Thank you very much, John. And the chair of our stakeholder advisory board, Laura Fernandez from UFIC. And a quick thank you also to my colleagues, Bernadette and Larissa, for all the support with all the technical background things that are going on as well. So maybe just to kick off, Bernadette, you could already move to the next slide, please. Many of you are probably familiar with who we are at JPI HDHL. Maybe I should mention that actually this week we have been renamed to HDHL Healthy Diet, Healthy Life, just to keep it a little bit shorter. And so I thought I'd quickly just explain a little bit about who we are and also what joint programming is. So joint programming is a public-public partnership, and it refers to the cooperation between member states. The Joint Programming Initiative, A Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life, focuses specifically on societal challenges that are related to food, nutrition, and to health. Next slide, please. So the original objective behind Healthy Diet, Healthy Life was to foster cooperation between member states, to focus on the societal challenges related to food, nutrition, and health, as well as to ensure alignment, development, coordination, and promotion of national and European SRIAs as well. And after 10 years as an EU-funded joint programming initiative, we are now starting our third year, which we're very excited about. Well, we're well into our third year, actually, 6 months in now, as an independent, self-sustaining initiative. HDHL has established itself as a valuable interdisciplinary research and innovation hub that connects scientists and policymakers in the fields of nutrition, health, food, and sustainability. Next slide. Here you can see a little bit more about our mission and who our members are. So we are a member state-driven initiative that consists of 18 countries. We have 11 full member countries at the moment. We mainly have European countries, but also Canada. Brazil has recently joined, which you can't actually see here at the moment, but that's because they were recently elected into our initiative just 2 months ago, as well as Brazil. And our governing structure includes a management board that consists of funders and various ministries, as well as of a scientific advisory board and a stakeholder advisory board. Next slide, please. This is just a nice infographic provided by our marketing department, but I think it's always nice to visualize our achievements. So here you can see some of the milestones that we've achieved in the first 10 years. I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight a few. We were established, of course, in 2010, 2011. The first SRIA was published in 2012. In 2016, you can see here the launch of the ERA HDHL and HDHL Intimic. 2017 was the launch of our CSA Fit for Food as well. And by 2020, you can see that the joint investment was made of 107 million euros that went into research here. And in 2021, we became a self-sustainable initiative. Next slide, please, Bernadette. Thank you. So this is, again, I'll try to keep this brief, but it's just to highlight again that we coordinate, align, promote, and lead with our scientific research agenda in the area of nutrition, food, health, and physical activity. We bring together ministries, funding agencies, research institutions from the health and food sectors to tackle societal challenges that no country itself could solve alone. And we have a wide range of knowledge, concrete outputs, as well as practical implications that are used to support policy development in various countries within Europe, but also beyond. So we do run our own HDHL calls, but we also align with other former JPIs or JPIs, as they still exist, to find synergies and to explore as well joint calls and different opportunities that there could be there. And we are also involved in several European initiatives, as you can see here. Some of them have been highlighted. Next slide, please. So our strategic research agenda focuses on 3 areas that you can see highlighted here. We have citizens' diet and behavior. We have the second area, which is food for health, and the third area, which is diet, health, and disease. So our strategic research agenda focuses on these 3 areas and the intersection between them as well. None of these areas are standalone for us. And we've also published a corresponding implementation plan as well. Yeah, next slide, it's okay, thank you. So this is just another infographic to highlight some of our milestones. Most importantly, not that we want to say one thing is more important than the other, but again, here for the purpose also for this presentation, I'd like to just highlight that we have run over 80 calls, which we're very, very proud of. Next slide. Thank you. So here you can see some of the calls that we have run. The colors correspond also to our research areas that I mentioned before as well. And our calls run approximately, the duration is approximately 3 to 4 years. So you can see that the calls that were launched last year, which is the Nutrimune and Food Retech, which I'll get into in a second, that is one that's running this year. And so we can say that our calls will still be running at least until 2027 at this point. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just to highlight the current call that we have just launched in February. It is now closed about a month ago. So yeah, you can see that the topic here is very fitting with today's webinar topic. So we focus on this call on new food resources and technologies to improve public health and food security. It's really just to highlight again that HDHL's research is very much focused on current and cutting edge topics. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here's just, if you could just leave it up for a second. Please do follow us, stay updated with our upcoming events as well, and do feel free to connect with us on our social media platforms. And so without much further ado, I'd really like to hand over to John Mathers. John is the chair of our scientific advisory board. Yes, sorry, it's quite a mouthful. John is a professor in human nutrition at Newcastle University, and he is also the director of the Human Nutrition Research Center and the director of the Center for Healthier Lives. I'm sure that was a very, very brief summary because we know, John, you do so many things and you've had so many achievements, but I know that you like to be modest about these. But thank you so much for being here today, and I'd like to hand over to you.
Jessie, thank you very much for your very kind introduction and also the summary of the work that HDHL is doing. So I'm delighted to add my welcome to this very topical webinar on ultra-processed foods. So food processing is not a new technology. For thousands of years, humans have been processing foods, and that application of technology has enabled our species to flourish in every region of the globe. Processes such as grinding, cooking, and fermentation have allowed us to make good use of a wide range of plant and animal materials, to store food safely over long periods of time, and of course, very importantly, to add pleasure to eating. But over the past few decades, something important seems to have happened. During this time, food industries have got bigger and become globalized, and food processing has become much more sophisticated. At the same time, the marketing of processed foods has also become highly sophisticated. The result is we can now access the same big branded foods almost everywhere. Also, importantly for most people, food has become relatively cheap as a proportion of incomes. And alongside these changes in food industry and the sourcing of food, there's been a remarkable rise in the prevalence of obesity and of a wide range of obesity-related diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, several cancers, and fatty liver disease. And the question has arisen, are ultra-processed foods to blame? And if so, what can be done about it? So in today's webinar, we have a stellar group of speakers who will address these issues. To start it off, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kevin Hall, who's Chief of the Integrative Physiology section at the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, part of the NIH. Dr. Hall is very well known for his carefully conducted studies on the regulation of body weight and metabolism, and he and his team develop and use mathematical models to describe, explain, and predict the results of their experiments. Importantly for today's webinar, Dr. Hall and his colleagues were the first to conduct a randomized controlled trial to compare the effects of eating ultra-processed foods compared with non-processed foods when people were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. Dr. Hall, a very warm welcome, and over to you to make a presentation on how do ultra-processed foods drive overeating and weight gain. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the organizers at JPI HDL. I think I got that right, probably not, but it was my first introduction to this group also. So thanks again for the introduction. I plan to jump right into a lot of discussion about our trial, and I'm glad that I've kept a particular slide in because I thought I was following Carlos Monteiro, who is the originator of this NOVA categorization system for categorizing foods. And I first heard about this probably about a decade ago now. And, you know, it really threw me for a loop because I focused most of my career on trying to understand how the human body adapted to changes in nutrients in the diet, specifically carbohydrates and fats, and what were the physiological adaptations to low carb diets or low fat diets and things like that. And I remember I was presenting some of our work at the Obesity Society meeting in Los Angeles, and a group from Brazil, though it was not the NOVA group I found out later, you know, came up to me after my talk and said, you know, why are you still focused on nutrients? You know, you should really be focused on the extent and purpose of processing of nutrients. I didn't understand what they were talking about, and they introduced me to this NOVA categorization system, which notably doesn't focus on nutrients at all, right? So there's no sort of nutrient base of categorizing foods the way that we would normally think about categorizing foods as being, you know, high in sodium, you know, high in saturated fat, things like the nutrient focused groups like myself had been focusing on for many years. And the way that they broke this up was to basically start with NOVA category group 1, which is the unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Basically the sort of whole foods that you can think about that are, you know, just basically directly separated from nature. You can wash them, you can do cooking, you can do some various minimal processes, but there's no, you know, substance added to these foods. And then there's category 2, which I like to think of as the foods that are culinary ingredients that you don't eat on their own. So no one is guzzling olive oil or eating butter as a stick, or, you know, pouring themselves bowls of salt or sugar to eat, right? Those are ingredients that are used in combination with group 1 foods to make meals or dishes or other foods. And those kind of combinations would be processed foods. So group 1 foods modified with the addition of group 2 ingredients, aiming to preserve and enhance the sensory qualities of foods. And then basically anything else by exclusion is in this group 4 called ultra processed foods, and it goes along with its own definition as well. And I'll read it here. It's the formulations of several ingredients that include original or chemically modified food substances obtained with the fractioning of whole foods and additives used to make the final product palatable or hyperpalatable. And the aim is to make convenient, tasteful, and low-cost products liable to replace all other NOVA food groups. And so this is the group of foods that these folks from Brazil had been telling me at this meeting in Los Angeles were the ones that were responsible for obesity. And it's not about the carbs or the fat per se, or sugar in the diets. And, I was really intrigued by this and kind of probed back to them and said, well, what is it that you think is about these foods that are causing people to overeat and gain weight? Because by that time, there had already been several observational epidemiology studies indicating that diets high in ultra-processed foods tend to be associated with increased risk for obesity, as well as many other downstream and potentially independent deleterious health consequences. And the answer that they gave to me, and again, this is not the NOVA group, but a group of people from Brazil using this system quite extensively. They said, well, one of the reasons why these foods lead to overeating and weight gain is because they're high in salt, sugar, and fat, and they're low in fiber. And that sort of kind of parroted the book by Michael Moss, this really interesting book about how to formulate foods that are very, very palatable, that hook us onto buying more of them. And of course, my reaction to that was, well, you just named a bunch of nutrients, right? We've known for years that, foods that are high in salt, sugar, and fat, and maybe low in fiber, and maybe even low in protein, can help drive people overeating. So have you really, is this really anything new? And I think that debate is still raging in the nutrition science and food science communities. Is the ultra processed food category really telling us anything new, or is it really just about these nutrients? And so, there's been a lot of debates. There's been a lot of back and forth commentaries about these things, and I decided to instead of entering in the debate directly, try to conduct an experiment to try to test this idea of whether or not ultra-processed foods, independent of their salt, sugar, fat, and fiber content, give rise to changes in human eating behavior. And so we designed an experiment where people came to live with us at the NIH Clinical Center for a pair of 4-week periods. And basically they were either randomized to begin the 2-week inpatient period of eating an ultra-processed diet or 2 weeks of eating an unprocessed diet. And so basically people were provided with more than sufficient calories to meet their energy needs. In fact, we estimated about twice the number of calories, so in excess of 5,000 calories a day on average. And these were people from a wide range of BMIs, 20 men and women. And they stayed with us for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we basically completely took over their food environment. So the only foods that they had access to were the snacks and the meals that we prepared for them when I say we, that's the amazingly talented dietitians and nutrition staff and chefs at the metabolic kitchen at the NIH Clinical Center. And so basically these folks were told, this isn't a weight loss study. It's not a weight gain study. Please just, you shouldn't be trying to change your body weight. Just eat as much or as little of these foods as you'd like. And I'll show you some examples of the menus in the next slide. But basically, we were measuring a whole bunch of things. And what they didn't know is that we were measuring their leftovers. So every day we would calculate how many calories that they ate, and that was the primary aim of our study. But they didn't know that we were doing this. And so what we basically did was they stayed for 2 weeks on one of these diets, and then they were switched to the opposite diet. And the idea here was to match the diets for the salt, the sugar, the fat, the fiber, and some other things that I'll mention here. So here's an example of the characteristics of the 3 daily meals. So they're matched for the energy content that was provided in the meals. They're matched for the carbs. They're matched for the percent fat. They're matched for the overall energy density of the meals. They're matched for sodium. They're matched for fiber, and they're matched for sugar. And so the idea was, if these nutrients were causing people to overeat, then if we prepared diets that are very different in terms of their ultra-processing versus unprocessing. In fact, the ultra-processed diet had 80% of calories from NOVA group 4 foods, and the unprocessed diet had 0% of calories from group 4 and 80% of calories from group 1 foods. And they are matched for these different nutrients, then there shouldn't be any difference in how many calories people eat, because it's the nutrients of concern that are driving the effect. At least that was my hypothesis going in. So here's an example of a menu. It was a 7-day rotating menu of the 3 meals on the ultra-processed diet. Again, they're matched for the presented calories, fat, carbs, sugar, sodium, fiber, energy density, and glycemic load to the unprocessed meals. So here's 3 meals from the 7-day rotating unprocessed diet menu. And again, people were instructed at each of these different meals to eat as much or as little as they wanted. And what they didn't know is that we were measuring their leftovers and calculating by difference how many calories that they ate, which was the primary outcome of our study. And so people did what they were told. They basically ate to the same level of hunger, fullness, satisfaction, and eating capacity on both of the diets, so that they weren't, trying to cut calories on one or increase their calories on another. They were just basically eating to the same level of appetite. And to my surprise, despite the diets being matched for all those nutrients of concern that were purported to be the mechanisms driving excess calorie intake, the ultra-processed diet still led to an increase in calorie intake over the 14 days of a little more than 500 calories per day. Whereas the same people, when they were eating the unprocessed diet, ate 500 calories per day less. And to demonstrate that this was an excess calorie intake, indeed, the period of time when people were on the ultra-processed diet, they were gaining weight, and during the unprocessed diet, they were losing weight. So spontaneous changes in weight, and they were blinded to their weight measurements, wearing loose-fitting clothing the entire time, so they couldn't tell if their clothes were getting tighter or looser. It was just quite remarkable that these 2 different diets that were matched for all of these nutrients, as well as overall energy density and whatnot, led to these kind of changes, and those were reflected in addition to, with the body fat changes. So body fat gain in the ultra-processed period of time, body fat lost during the unprocessed diet period. And one of the other interesting things that I found in this study was that there was a pretty substantial individual variability between the energy intake differences between ultra-processed and unprocessed, which is on the x-axis here. So you can see that while the mean is about 500 calories per day, there's quite a large scatter with one subject eating almost 1,700 calories a day more on the ultra-processed diet than the unprocessed diet, and some people eating more or less the same number of calories on the ultra-processed diet and unprocessed diet. I don't know how repeatable this is, this variability. If we took the same subjects and measured them again, would they also fall in the same sort of rank order? I don't know. But interestingly, there's no magic here. The changes in body weight are directly related to the changes in calorie intake. So there's no magic about ultra-processed foods that defies the law of energy conservation. It's just that they lead people to overeat calories. And the question really then is why is that the case? And why is it that some people appear at least to be more susceptible to this than others? Just to kind of break this down a little bit, the calorie increases on the ultra-processed diet were entirely driven by carbohydrate and fat increases. So protein was not different between the 2 diets, but calories from carbohydrate and fat were both more or less equivalently elevated in the ultra-processed diet. This was really reflected not in the snacks that we provided people. So there was no significant difference between the ultra-processed and unprocessed snacks that people ate, but at breakfast, dinner, and lunch, people consumed substantially more calories, and that's where the difference in overall energy intake came. So now we have this observation. In my view, a surprising observation, given the things that we tried to match in these two diets. And of course, you can't match everything in any sort of nutrition study. But we're stuck with this observation now that diets that are high in ultra-processed foods caused people to gain weight and gain body fat by eating excess calories compared to when the same people ate a diet that was, again, matched for various nutrients of concern, but led to weight loss and body fat loss and lower calorie intake. And so, I'm putting an ink blot or a Rorschach test here because I think that, there have been so many hypotheses about why it was that we observed this effect. And, very strong opinions out there that, this is, something that has been well known, or this is something novel, it's some, particular additive or ingredient in the ultra processed foods that we didn't match for, some other sort of characteristic of these ultra processed foods, or the eating behavior surrounding those ultra processed foods. And of course, all of those hypotheses are merely hypotheses until you actually do a test, right? But we can go back and take a look at our data post hoc as a hypothesis generating tool and see, what was it about these ultra processed foods or meals that was giving rise to some of these differences in behavior and in eating behavior. And so one thing that kind of popped out initially was that maybe they just liked the ultra processed foods more. But when we asked people to rate the meals for their pleasantness, they didn't actually report significant differences in pleasantness. So maybe we're underpowered to detect it. I don't know. But there was no significant differences in pleasantness. And they weren't more familiar with the ultra processed foods compared to the unprocessed foods. So there wasn't some sort of neophobia associated with foods in the unprocessed diet that led people to eat less of them. And that's kind of partly by design because people needed to name a certain threshold fraction of the foods before they entered the study, because we wanted to avoid some sort of neophobia effect. But fortunately, post hoc, they actually also reported being equally familiar with both diet menus. It wasn't that there was like large glucose spikes or something like that in the ultra processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. So the coefficient of variation for glucose as measured by continuous glucose monitors was pretty much identical. The average glucose levels was pretty much identical between the two diets. So there was no hint of any changes. And again, the diets were matched for glycemic load. So that probably shouldn't be too big of a surprise. One thing that was interesting was that when we timed how long it took people to eat the meals, again, they didn't know that that was happening. They ate the ultra processed meals more quickly, both in terms of the grams per minute as well as the overall calories per minute. And so that hints at something. I think Dr. Feskens may talk a little bit about this in her presentation. One thing that was pointed out was that even though we matched the overall energy density of the meals, if you take out the beverages, there was quite a big difference in energy density. And if beverages don't contribute to satiation or satiety in the same way that solid foods do, you might expect that these differences could be due to the well-known effects of overall energy density of foods apart from the beverages. So that's kind of interesting. And so we more recently did some analyses where we removed the beverages from some of our calculations. And interestingly, when you remove the beverages from some of the calculations, now the ultra processed meals were actually eaten quite a bit slower than the unprocessed meals in terms of grams per minute. But because of the energy density of the foods being quite different, that preserved the calories per minute increase in eating rate. So in terms of mass per unit time, ultra processed foods themselves on the meals, once you get rid of the beverages, were eaten more slowly, not more quickly as was sort of originally thought. But still, we preserve this increase in calorie eating rate, primarily because of the differences in the non-beverage energy density of the meals. Another potential factor came from a professor at University of Kansas, Tara Fazzino, who had developed this quite novel system for quantifying whether or not a food would meet a threshold of being hyperpalatable. And unlike many people in the field who've really looked at the psychophysics of pleasantness of eating meals, she went a different route, and she decided to look at whether or not a food exceeded certain thresholds for combinations of nutrients, including fat and sodium, fat and simple sugars, as well as carbs and sodium. And if these pairs of nutrients exceeded certain thresholds, she deems them hyperpalatable, according to this definition in this obesity paper that came out more or less the same time as our paper came out in Cell Metabolism. And so she contacted me and she said, were the overall diets matched for hyperpalatable foods? And I didn't know what she meant exactly, and so I looked at her definitions. And at first I said, there's no way that they were different because the overall diets were matched for fat, sodium, sugars, and carbs. But she said, yeah, the overall diets were, but what about the individual foods on the plate? Did you provide more individual foods that exceeded these different thresholds, even though the overall diets may have been matched for these different nutrients? And sure enough, she was right. We actually did present people with more of these foods that met these nutrient thresholds in the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. And so now we have a couple of different hypotheses about what is it that is driving the excess calorie intake. We have more hyperpalatable foods, we have differences in eating rate, and we have differences in energy density, and there's a whole other long list of things, including that the diets seem to be a little bit lower in protein, but still we're talking within 2% of calories. So we ended up going back to our individual meal data and developing linear mixed models of ad libitum meal energy intake. Again, this is all post hoc, but we included in the model the effects of energy density, eating rate, the protein content of the meals, and the percentage of calories in the meal from hyperpalatable foods. And all of these factors were significantly related to positively related to energy intake at a given meal. And these are the standardized beta coefficients showing that, really the energy density and the percentage of hyperpalatable foods is driving quite a bit of the effect here. And surprisingly, protein content ended up also being positively contributing, which is, a little bit confusing still to me, but it was, highly statistically significant in our model. And so these factors, interestingly, not only led to increased energy intake in the ultra-processed meals, the same factors were driving energy intake during the unprocessed diet as well. So it seems like just because the ultra-processed diet had more of had a greater eating rate and had a greater energy density and the hyperpalatable foods were greater, may have been part of the difference. Although I actually misspoke, the eating rate in grams per minute ended up being lower, and the protein content ended up being lower. So really, could be down to the energy density in the hyperpalatable foods. And indeed, when we did a mediation analysis of the difference between the ultra-processed energy intake and the unprocessed diet energy intake, both the energy density and hyperpalatable foods appeared to mediate about 40%, a little bit more than 40% of the effect of the ultra-processed versus unprocessed diets. Now, again, this is all post hoc, kind of exploratory, hypothesis-generating analysis. And so really, to get at this, you need to do a new study. And indeed, that's what we're doing. We have a study underway now at the NIH Clinical Center, where we're comparing ad libitum energy intake between 4 different test diets this time, provided for 1 week each in randomized counterbalance sequence. And basically the original 2 diets, slightly modified. One is unprocessed diet. So again, 80% of calories from NOVA category 1 foods. 0% from ultra-processed foods. That's low in non-beverage energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods. And then The second diet is very similar to our original diet. That's 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods, high in non-beverage energy density, and high in hyperpalatable foods. All of these diets are matched for the same nutrients of concern that I mentioned before. So they're matched for fiber, they're matched for the carbs, the sugar, the salt, the fat. They're better matched for protein than they were in the first round. But then we actually have added 2 new reformulated ultra-processed diets. One that's high in non-beverage energy and energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods, and then a final one that's still 80% of calories from ultra-processed food that's low in non-beverage energy density and low in hyperpalatable foods. And so this study is now underway, and we've, I think, completed 9 or 10 people here at the NIH Clinical Center, each living with us for a month at a time, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We can kind of do a couple of these people at a time. And so I hope to have an answer for whether or not these are the 2 big contributors to why diets high in ultra-processed food lead to overeating and weight gain sometime, in the next year or 2. It takes a long time to run these studies. But with that, I'd just like to end and obviously thank all the people who do the real work. And that slide is missing for some reason, and I'm sorry about that. So thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation of a very, very important trial. We have a number of questions in the chat. I'm just going to pick out 1 or 2 of them to get us started. You already mentioned something about the protein side, and one of the questioners asks, could it be that the people overeat on the ultra-processed diet because they want to get the same amount of protein? So a test of the protein leverage hypothesis.
Yeah, so we thought about that when we were writing that paper, and we decided to calculate how much of that effects could have been due to protein leverage. And even if we assumed perfect protein leverage, it turned out that in terms of the calorie differences that would be assumed, given the slight differences in protein that we offered to people, it could explain at most half of the effect of calories. And even then, that's assuming perfect protein leverage, which even the, Dr. Simpson and Robbenheimer don't say that there is perfect protein leverage. So I don't think that can fully explain our results, but we have taken that seriously and matched the protein content of the diets provided in the new trial a little bit more closely than we did in the last trial.
Thank you very much. And there's a question about mechanisms. Dr. Butler asks, how did the insulin differ between the diets? I guess they're trying to think about how that might affect appetite.
Yeah, so insulin, I'm trying to remember exactly, when we looked at for example, C-peptide, 24-hour C-peptide, which is a measure of total insulin secretion, I believe it was slightly higher in the ultra-processed diet, but I don't think we can, distinguish whether or not that's because they're eating 500 extra calories a day versus driving that effect. So I can't rule it out, but I don't think that there's, solid evidence to suggest that that's a causal factor.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question about hyperpalatable foods. The question is, how well validated is the scheme for identifying these hyperpalatable foods?
Well, I don't think identification is the problem, right? Because they're based on objective thresholds for, sodium, carbohydrates, and simple sugars and fat. So that's easy. So unlike the NOVA system, I think that there's very clear definitions there. Whether or not it actually corresponds to people's, subjective likeness, how much they like the food, is, I think, an open question. Of course, reward is not just about liking, it's also about wanting, which is a somewhat different construct that Kent Berridge has been well known for distinguishing. And so whether or not hyperpalatable food leads to increased liking in addition to wanting, or the reverse, is, I think, an open question.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think at that point, we better draw a halt to this discussion because we're running a little bit behind. So thank you again for your presentation. I'd now like to introduce Professor Carlos Monteiro. Carlos is Professor of Nutrition and Public Health at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and he and his colleagues developed the NOVA classification system for foods based on the type and extent of processing. And very importantly, he and his colleagues have also worked with collaborators all around the world to investigate links between ultra-processed food consumption and human health. Professor Monteiro, a very warm welcome, and over to you to make your presentation on ultra-processed foods and human health, the thesis and the evidence. Are you able to share your presentation? Perhaps one of the secretariat could help.
I think the mic is still muted as well, actually.
Yeah, I think you're muted, Carlos.
Okay, yes, okay, my mic is okay right now. I'll try to share my screen, but I'm not familiar with this the Microsoft, so that's the whole problem with me, because I'm used with the Zoom. So I'll try to share. If not, I'll ask you to share my presentation because I sent you before. So let me make an attempt.
If it doesn't work, we can also share it, Carlos. That's not a problem.
Yeah, but please do yes. Share.
Yeah, I think it's probably easier, of course. We understand. Yeah. No problem. Okay. So just give us 1 moment.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, please put full screen, please. Yeah, could you put full screen?
We didn't actually receive a PowerPoint, so we only have this PDF.
No, yeah, but I mean, with the PDF, you could put visualize and the full screen. It's better. Yeah, the full screen mode.
Yeah, 1 moment. We're trying to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there we go. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Deeply sorry. I'll try to be very quick. So please, next slides. So this the outline of my presentation. I'll describe the main thesis linking ultra-processed foods and human health and the underlying hypothesis. Then I'll see the evidence and research gaps and policy implications if you have time. Next. I assume that most people or everyone attending this meeting is familiar with the NOVA food system classification. So I will not go into the detail on definition of ultra-processed food. There's not enough time. Next. I just want to say that the NOVA divides foods not according to the data to nutrient profile as standard, but according to extent and purpose of industrial processing. Some people feel strange about using purpose to define a food group, but it's important to say that the purpose of processing influence the extent of processing, and the extent of processing influence the final product. For instance, in the case of ultra-processed foods, the industry does these products aiming to replace all other novel food groups, traditional dietary patterns, and at the same time maximizing industry profits. But to maximize industry profit, it's important to use cheap ingredients, in this case, cheap food substance and additives. So that's the whole idea about using extent and purpose of food processing. Next. It's also important to state that the ultra-processed food, because of their processing, they have some attributes that are important to understand how they succeed in displace all other non-ultra-processed foods. They have affordable prices because of low-cost ingredients. They are convenient. They are ready to consume. They are designed to be ready to consume and to have long durations. They are engineered to have craving-like palatability, and they are aggressively marketed. So all these explain why they succeed to displace other Nova food groups. Next. A final word about the Nova and the concept of ultra-processed foods. The main metric from Nova is the dietary share, the UPF dietary share. So this is calculated very easily, summing all the ultra-processed foods in the diet and divided by the total dietary intake, expressed in kilograms or in kilocalories or grams. Most studies that I'll present, they use this metric to assess diets and to assess the relationship with diet quality and ill health. Next. What's the main thesis? I'll read. The global displacement of long-established dietary patterns based on Nova groups 1, 2, and 3 by dietary patterns based on UPFs has been and is a major driver of the pandemics of obesity, diabetes, and other disease, and as such must be detained and reverted by public policy. This is the main hypothesis. Next. 3 hypotheses sustain this thesis. So the first one is that UPFs are really effectively globally displacing long-established dietary patterns based on group 1, 2, and 3. The second hypothesis is that the increased dietary share of UPFs has ill effects on various health-related attributes of the overall diet, including but not restricted to imbalanced nutrient profiles. And finally, the increased dietary share of ultra-processed foods increases risk of obesity, diabetes, and other diseases through various mechanisms. Next. So, what are the evidence on these 3 hypotheses and what are the research gaps? Next. First of all, I have to say that most evidence I will present were produced in the last 2-3 years. So it's very natural that we have to review this in 2-3 years, and probably the result will have much more studies. But what I'll do right now is to present the state of art in the evidence of these 3 hypotheses. Next. So it's also important to say that the Nova system and the concept of ultra-processed food were developed at my university in Brazil. I'm very proud of this. University of São Paulo team developed this. But the most evidence now, the bulk of evidence now is produced by researchers in different countries, in different institutions. You have just a sample of institutions that produce evidence on ultra-processed food. Next one. So, the evidence on the first hypothesis, displacement of traditional dietary patterns. Next. The best evidence comes from Canada. So in Canada, thanks to Jean-Claude Mubarak and his team, we have time trends on the consumption, on national consumption of food in Canada, according to Nova. So it's quite clear in this case that ultra-processed food has been replacing group 1, group 2 particularly, and also group 3 foods in Canada. Next one. We also have national time trends for the dietary share of ultra-processed food for other countries. So you see in case of China, dietary surveys show a relatively low consumption, but a very important increase, almost 3 times in 20 years. The same Spain, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And also US and UK, we will see some increase in US and some stability in the UK, but at very high levels. Next one. The most comprehensive evidence on trends in consumption of ultra-processed foods come from sales data. So Euromonitor monitors sales of different food products in the 91 countries, and this is the figure you have. So in lower and middle and upper middle income countries, increasing trends are very clear, and some stability we see in this period, 2007-2022, in high income countries. Next. So it looks that up to now, there are some increase. The missing figures here are about low-income countries. So I can tell more about this, but it's very likely that very soon we'll have data on low-income countries from Gallup World Poll. But what about the second hypothesis? What's the evidence that the dietary contribution has ill effects on various health-related attributes of the overall diet? Next one. The best data in this case comes from a systematic review of national dietary surveys focused on 13 countries where it was possible to relate the dietary share of ultra-processed food to the nutrient profile of the diet. Next one. So you can see that in all these countries, the more ultra-processed food in the diet, the higher the dietary share of ultra-processed foods. We have more saturated fat, more sugar, less fiber, less protein, and less potassium. So it looks a recipe for chronic diseases, right? So this is clearly demonstrate that the more ultra-processed food in the diet deteriorated dietary nutrient profile. Next one. The same review also examined the relationship between dietary share of ultra-processed food and energy intake. It is very clear that there's a positive relationship, but this was, as you saw, much better demonstrated by a Kevin Hall trial. Next one. I said hypothesis 2 said that part of the effect on the diet was on deterioration of dietary nutrient profile, but there are other effects of UPF intake. Here I'm describing 9 effects, ill effects of UPF consumption that goes beyond the deterioration of dietary nutrient profile. Reduced fruits, vegetables, and legumes, reduced phytochemicals, reduced total water intake. Those are from Haynes studies. Increased phthalates and bisphenol A, increased acrylamide and other new formed substances, increased emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, colorants, flavor enhancers, all these from the Nutrinet Santé cohort. There's also evidence, and Kevin mentioned, about the fact that UPF have soft texture and high energy density, and this together makes diet with increased energy intake rate, and this leads to a higher total energy intake. Food addiction, pro-inflammatory gut microbiota. So there are many potential mechanisms for the negative effect of diet on diet quality and therefore on disease. Next one. So what about the direct evidence linking ultra-processed foods to the risk of disease? Next. The best evidence here comes from cohort studies, large long-duration cohort studies. Now more than 70 cohort studies were done with a good adjustment of potential confounders. And what these studies demonstrate was a prospective dose-response association between increased UPF intake and 20 health outcomes: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, CVD, gastrointestinal, kidney, liver disease, depression, and all-cause mortality. And these are very high-quality cohort studies from very well-known cohorts. Next one. This is a new slide. So I prepared these for this meeting in particular. This is from a paper we are in preparation. And here you see the results, meta-analysis for the prospective association between UPF and different health outcomes for outcomes that where we have at least 3 studies. So there are 16 health outcomes with 3 or more cohort studies. In 14 out of these 16 health outcomes, significant higher relative risk for high consumption of high versus low consumption of ultra-processed food were demonstrated. So some people say, oh, these are observational studies, this is just association. No, this is not just association. when you have an exposure like UPF intake and 14 of 16 health outcomes with positive association, this is more than association. But of course, the discussion on causality between exposure and outcomes is complex and requires other information, particularly information on mechanism. Next one. And I want to remember that the third hypothesis we propose state that the increased dietary contribution of ultra-processed food increase the risk of different diseases through various mechanisms. So what are these mechanisms? You heard before Kevin Hall, which is an expert on studies that can provide information on mechanism, stating several possibilities. Next one. But what epidemiological studies, not experimental, but epidemiological studies, what they inform about mechanism? This is a very interesting review based on 37 cohort studies linking UPF with different diseases, showing that after, so in these studies, the authors, they compare the association between UPF and disease before adjustment for nutrients and after adjustment. And their conclusion was that there was minimal impact of these adjustments. So this means that other factors beyond fat and sugar and sodium and fiber are important to explain the association. Next one. This actually was Kevin Hall demonstrated in a very clear way that regarding weight gain, there are more mechanisms than calories, than sugar, fiber, and macronutrients. So this trial and the previous analysis, they don't say that nutrients are not important, not at all. They say there are more factors that can explain the association besides nutrients. Next one. So what is my take on this? I mean, after considering all the evidence, my take on this is that it's very likely that the different combinations of different mechanisms are important for different diseases. So for different diseases, we have perhaps for obesity, energy densities, soft texture are more important. Maybe for other diseases, additives are more important. So it's probably a combination of this. And I suspect that there's more than one. There's not a single mechanism linking UPF with different diseases. So this will require certainly a lot of more studies. This is a fascinating area of research, but next one, I want to leave this with you a question. Do we need to know the exact combination of mechanisms that link UPF to each disease before recommending for people to reduce or avoid its consumption, and for policymakers to implement actions to make this feasible? Next one. My answer for this is no. I mean, we do have enough evidence to do policies, but what are the policies that we could apply? Next one. I think it's a good, we can learn a lot about fighting tobacco use. And why is that? Because there are many similarities between tobacco and ultra-processed foods. First of all, they are not necessary. Although they are consumed by many people, they are not necessary. You can live without ultra-processed food. Second of all, they cause many diseases. Third, they have a addictive potential. Four, they are highly profitable, and as such, they are manufactured by large corporations that are very powerful. And this explains why in countries as US, more than 50% of the energy intake comes from ultra-processed food. But this doesn't mean that we have to live with this. That's impossible to revert this. This was possible to revert with tobacco. Next one. what public health did regarding tobacco. First of all, informing the population, providing reliable information to the population. In this case, in the case of ultra-processed food, means to review dietary guidelines. Next one. Fortunately, that now more than 10 countries have dietary guidelines recommending reduction or avoidance of ultra-processed food. Some medical societies like the American Heart Association did the same. But information is not enough. Next one. Here you see all other policies, particularly regulatory policies that were applied in the case of tobacco with great success. So essentially, we should do the same thing. Regulating marketing is very important. Taxation is important. There are many tools that our public health have available that could be used in the case of ultra-processed food. And some countries are already doing this, particularly in Latin America. Next one. So, many thanks. Sorry for the quick presentation. Thank you.
Carlos, thank you very much indeed. Can I just pick up one of the questions that relates to the final part of your talk, which is the policy implications? So you've argued that we should be reducing the intakes, and one of the questioners asks, can we make dietary recommendations drawn from the research done so far? So, for example, can you set an upper limit, maybe 20%?
Well, that's a big question. We have been looking for this threshold a lot. So but what the data said about the information we got from the data of these, of course, these observational studies, these cohort studies, is that there's a dose response. So we were not still able to identify a threshold, but it's very clear that all these mechanisms that we mentioned before, they are dose dependent, right? So of course, if the consumption is, let's say, 5% or 10% of calories, probably this won't have a big effect on health. But certainly if this goes beyond 20, 30%, then certainly the problems start to appear.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question about food equity. So if we replace ultra-processed foods with unprocessed foods, will this mean that food becomes more expensive and so less affordable? Carlos, are you still there? Is Carlos still with us?
I think he disappeared.
I think he's disappeared.
Maybe you pushed the wrong button.
Okay. Well, since we're running a little bit behind, what I suggest is we hold other questions for Carlos until the end. And now I'll introduce our final speaker, Professor Edith Feskens, who's Professor of Global Nutrition at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Professor Feskens' core expertise is in nutritional epidemiology, including the development of scalable interventions. And one example of that is the way in which her work on prevention of type 2 diabetes is now being rolled out through the Dutch basic health insurance system. She's currently working on combating malnutrition in all its forms globally, especially in low and middle income countries. And she's concerned as well with the trade-offs with sustainability. Professor Feskens, a very warm welcome, and over to you to make your presentation on ultra-processed foods, implications for research and policy.
Thanks, John, Professor Matters. How much time do I have? Can you guide me a little bit? Because I see me running behind. Yeah, okay, I'll try to be efficient with my slides. Okay, thanks very much. I hope you can see them. If I don't hear anybody, I assume you can see them. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yep, for the kind introduction. hold close the JPI Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life close to my heart, as I've been, amongst others, as a chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for the past years. And I see in that with John Meadows, it's all in good hands. And I like to come back to these 3 areas already introduced by Jessie Doppler in the beginning at the back of my talk. Of course, we are talking about research, and this research, in my case, also, well, in our department case, I would say, runs up until the molecule and the cell, up until population, but nowadays also food systems, and of course, a healthy planet. Let me see how I can do this. Yeah, I'm very happy nowadays that our guidelines are now food-based dietary guidelines and not focused on single nutrients anymore. And I think Professor Monteiro previously showed that it is really important. This is an example of the Netherlands because I'd like to illustrate my story alongside the example of whole grain bread, which is part of our food-based dietary guideline in the Netherlands, which is called the Wheel of Five. You see the bread here, and we are advised to take at least a couple of slices a day. It's our staple, as in many Northwestern European countries. Now, our worry about processing already began, quite many years ago with EPIC, a famous European multi-center cohort. And that showed in their analysis that highly processed foods were an important source of the nutrients considered, but also not only nutrients, for example, contributing 70 to 80% in the Netherlands to mean energy intake. And that worries us because, of course, our obesity epidemic. If we look now at more recent data, we see in all other Northwestern countries in Europe quite high energy contribution by ultra-processed food, about 40%. And this is actually here, Belgium, Austria, Germany as well. Do you think that we are all, eating McDonald's or drinking sugar-sweetened beverages or cakes, cookies and pastries? No. The problem is a little bit, at least at that time for sure, that in the highly processed foods, all cereal products were include all our breads, our staple. Which, makes it a little bit or at least not a little bit, a large overestimation of the percentage or the proportion of ultra-processed food in the calories of our diet. Now, Professor Monteiro has introduced the NOVA classification, and luckily here in the processed food, not the ultra-processed foods, we have the artisanal bread, and that is very nice. But I must say, indeed, all the other breads are here. And just as an example, still we have that. The earlier data I showed, they were from EPIC, but now we have here. I hope you see it because something in my thing is wrong. 55% of energy in the Netherlands is contributed by ultra-processed food, but also sodium, but also they provide a large source of fiber, and you can guess why, because of the breads. Now, is bread in the Netherlands ultra-processed? In the paper I just showed you by Reina Vellega and my colleagues, yes, indeed, they classified all bread as ultra-processed. Now, my bread looks like this, and I buy it at this bakery shop. This is my baker, or sometimes I buy it in my supermarket. This is my supermarket. And what you see, it looks artisanal bread. Of course, it isn't completely because of shelf life. So you see here some emulgators, the fatty acids, for example. So not much, but at least some. Enough, according to the NOVA classification, to classify it as ultra-processed. Well, remember, we have it in our food-based dietary guideline. Of course, I could do the artisanal bread at home, have my baking machine and make it myself. And then, indeed, all the basic ingredients are there. But, of course, it takes time. And, of course, the shelf life is less. And this small story, of course, underlies what happens worldwide. One thing I have is in nutritional epidemiology is how to assess ultra-processed foods and drinks reliably. Here we have our charming one of our dietitians with her bread in the lunchbox. I can't see whether it's ultra-processed or whether it's artisanal. And she knows because she's a dietitian. But if I ask one of my participants, it's usually unclear. And again, we have stories also about different people coding the foods. So overall, that is one issue, I think, which concerns nowadays the NOVA classification. As Carlos Monteiro already introduced, of course, it's a global issue, and we see the trends overall. This is the example. Again, I'd like to focus on the baked goods. I don't need to show you the sugar-sweetened beverages all over the globe. I want to concentrate again on this one, the white ones, the baked goods. Again, as showed earlier, a quite large proportion in Australasia, North America, in Western Europe, and in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm looking forward to Carlos' newer results in his paper. How come? Well, of course, it's convenience and it's also marketing. We already thought that. We have here in the high-income countries 60% of the distribution of our foods through the supermarkets, but the supermarkets are rising all over the globe. Is that a good idea? Well, actually, we did some work here in Zambia on the left-hand side that the people indicated that they preferred not so much the ultra-processed food, but at least the packaged food because of food safety. And on the other hand, we worked in Vietnam and we saw that there also the government has a stricter policy to increase the number of supermarkets to enhance the sales and support the farmers to provide income. So there is a trade-off if we look on the, let's say, food system level. And I'd like to briefly allude to this nice paper of Boyd Swinburne, not easy to read, but it was also published in 2019 about the global syndemic, what we do in economics and policies, and of course, transport and food relates to our intake and the trade-off between obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. Now, I need to say, and we all know, that indeed not always the association between the percentage of energy intake for ultra-processed food and obesity is associated with UPF is associated with obesity. And of course, to my concern, this is in these right-hand side of countries, high intake of ultra-processed foods, which can be a lot of bread, which can be a lot of fiber, which is, of course, we all know that, and we showed ourselves earlier, inversely associated with the risk of developing obesity and inversely associated with the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, for example. So the picture is not that straightforward. Bernard Schroer already alluded to, had a very nice paper in The Lancet last year. Indeed, many studies relate UPF with disease and mortality risk in cohorts. Many different diseases with many different etiologies. A very interesting paper on diabetes was recently published and included also the people from Harvard, including one of my colleagues, and they showed that the intake of ultra-processed food is positively associated with the incidence of type 2 diabetes in the famous Harvard cohorts. You see that here. And this was matched with our meta-analysis. But my concern is here on the right-hand side. I think ultra-processed food is not, let's say, one big similar basket. It is very heterogeneous. And you see here, for example, that if you look at the ultra-processed bread and cereals, as expected from previous epidemiologic research and trials, higher intake is associated with lower type 2 diabetes risk. On the other hand, you see the usual suspect, the sauces, the spreads and contaminants, and also sugar-sweetened beverages. I'll come back to the artificially sweetened one later. My colleague, Kevin Ford, and my other colleagues proposed that indeed the work of Kevin Hall, a very nice and carefully done intervention study, could be explained by differences in eating rate and differences in texture. You see here the energy rate of the foods which are classified according to NOVA as ultra-processed, but you can also see that there are processed and unprocessed food with high eating rate, energy intake in kilocalories per minute. Note that we recently showed that in observational studies, people with a self-report eating rate have higher BMIs, for example. It's a cross-sectional study, so the evidence, we need to dig into that, but with trials, I think we can come much further. And luckily, my same colleague group have recently finished a trial, the Vogue study, and I am happy I can share some slides, although not all. The paper is under submission, but the results have been presented at the conference. And what they did is trying to tease out the things that Kevin already alluded to. It's either the ultra processed, is it due to the texture and eating slow or eating fast? And they carefully provided in total 288 meals and looked at what happened in this factorial design. So the daily intake of breakfast, lunch, dinner, desserts, and snack was prepared in 4 different ways. I'll show a picture later. By modifying the texture, you see here in breakfast, for example, unprocessed slow was a fresh mixed fruit bowl. In the fast version of the unprocessed food, it was a homemade smoothie. In the ultra processed food, of course, it was a store-bought smoothie with some, let's say, additives for increasing the shelf life. And in the slow ultra processed bowl was a can of mixed fruit. So here the type of texture manipulation was solid versus liquid, but also sometimes hardness and piece size, etc. More later by all the others involved, and I'm happy to provide the paper later on. When it's published, the daily food intake showed the results like this: a 22% difference between the hard and the soft daily intake, irrespective of being unprocessed versus processed. So this indicates that doesn't matter so much. It is the texture. And for example, Kevin, it's a good look to think about indeed your beverages, which of course is a softer texture than the hard texture. So my issue 2 is NOVA. It's not only difficult to assess, but also a very heterogeneous group of foods and drinks, which is hard to study, but also hard to implement. And having a guideline of, let's say, max 20% of your energy of ultra-processed food is, I think, very hard to develop. And also this picture shows that the foods indeed looked very similar, and also the palatability was similar. Again, now about the etiology. How can UPF underlie so many different diseases? Is it something else? Is it, for example, not only eating rate? Is it maybe the cost? Is it socioeconomic position? Well, let's see here first at what Bertrand Schroer has devised in his paper, a very nice review. And if you focus on this, I think we all agree that increased amounts of salt, sugar, saturated fats, and energy, and also potentially decreased amounts of fiber, vitamins, and micronutrients. So the lower nutritional quality, of course, is something which you don't want. And many ultra-processed foods, but not all, have that. On the right-hand side, we have the contaminants from packaging materials. That is possible, but also note that at least in our Netherlands, in the supermarkets, our fresh vegetables are also sometimes or often packaged in some foil. And on the left-hand side, we see the impact on digestibility, the bioavailability of nutrients, duration of chewing, the increased eating rate, overconsumption we already discussed, a highly likely underlying factor. We also have something related to sweetness to tell. We had that in the previous slide, but in our own work, we indeed see in our epidemiological studies, the higher the sugar-sweetened beverage intake, the higher the mortality. The higher the intake of fruit juice, the higher the mortality, although not with a small dose. And some also intriguing to discuss later, a higher intake of low or no calorie sweetened beverages is associated with an increased mortality, but not as strong as the sugar sweetened beverages, and maybe reverse causation is involved. Contaminants from processing could be acrylamide. I think it's already gone from the foods, like the trans fatty acids, but in some countries it may be there. So that is a good thing to look at as a policymaker. Advanced glycation end products, perhaps a new kid on the block. We are investigating that and many others, but whether that is responsible for all these types of effects, I'm not sure. And then the additives. I'm not an expert in additives, I'm not a toxicologist, but indeed the sweeteners we already discussed, the coloring you can think we can do without, why bother, the emulsifier, shown to be associated with some diseases like potentially IBD, Crohn's disease. I saw that in the Nutrinet Santé cohort, very interesting results, but it's also difficult to imagine that an emulsifier, well, we have natural emulsifiers like lecithin in our eggs, so you start wondering how does this small amount of additive really can have such an important impact. Is there perhaps not something like residual confounding involved or some misclassification of intake? Finally, it may be simply eating rate, but in any case, I echo the others. The underlying biological mechanism of the NOVA4 classification of ultra-processed foods and drinks is not completely clear. Of course, we talked about the high palatability. I'm not going to discuss that now, but I must say that my own bread and the bread I buy at my bakery are, to me, equally tasty. I don't taste any difference, and I suspect that in many cases the things we buy in the market, like a cookie or the cookie we make ourselves in our kitchen, I wonder whether there really differences in palatability or hedonics, liking and wanting, can be found. But that is something future studies. Finally, I'd like to show that indeed ultra-processed food are indirectly already included in many guidelines. For example, this one from the American Heart Association, adjust energy intake, we all agree. Eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, we all agree. And in the Dutch one, we say it can be canned, but in these cans should not add sugar, for example. Choose healthy sources of protein and avoid processed forms. We have that in our guidelines. Reduce the amount of red meat and reduce the amount of processed meat. And minimize the intake of beverages with added sugar. That's also part of existing guidelines. And here the American Heart Association indicates there's no commonly accepted definition of UPF, and some healthy foods may exist within the UPF food category, and that is my concern for the whole grain bread. Of course, there are also other benefits, the convenience, the taste and the cost we already discussed. The product reformulation, that could be good, and in some cases we try to take out the sugar and the salt and the high fat. But most importantly, my concern for the low and middle income countries is that we use fortification by adding essential nutrients like iron or vitamin A, and if they are classified as an UPF and taken out in some policy as to being avoided, that would really not beneficial for the health status. The same is from the sustainability point of view, the meat alternatives. Likewise, I think they're very helpful in helping the people to make the transition to reduce their meat intake. And they contain quite a lot of salt. Of course, you need to look at the nutrient content in terms of salt and fiber and fat. But apart from that, I don't think there's nothing much wrong with them. And in individual cases, of course, in case breastfeeding doesn't work for the mother, formula milk, of course, is essential. So I'd like to close with some recommendations for a healthy diet, healthy life. I would say we still need to know more about the various UPFD impacts on health and look at the etiology, the causality. I would also give, in a practical sense, try to give real underpinning to the different health rankings of foods, because people and consumers are getting confused and we need to be able to underpin it. Otherwise, the consumers and the health professionals and also the other stakeholders are going to give different messages. And finally, also the public health policies should focus on improving that healthy diet and stimulate avoiding unhealthy foods and drinks, and for sure connect with experts in the food and nutrition field. For the food and health area, I would suggest that we focus more on promoting mild processing, the intact food matrix, and also reduce the environmental impact of food processing, because we need it. We don't want to use lots of food processing per se, but it makes food more safe, more convenient, more available. But of course, we also want to look at the price. In addition, and that relates to, let's say, the big multinationals, I think they're big ships and difficult to steer, but for the smaller companies, and especially in the low and middle income countries, need to look at the type of business models, which can we make them in such a way that they stimulate, the right type of produce, which is useful for health and sustainability. And of course, I'd like to see the healthy diet and the sustainable diet as an important point of entry in the total food system and transforming the food system. So not focusing on the traditional agriculture production and the quantity, but on the quality. And finally, for the multinationals, I think we need to do and work with them or force them, whatever works, to do work on responsible marketing. And this one is the most important one, or I have a longer list on citizens' diet and behavior. For sure, we need to improve the intake of assessment and intake of additives and include, for example, branded items in our dietary assessment, which is often not possible now. We need to know more what front of pack labeling works and how this should look, and whether the impact on the planetary health should be included, and to what extent we can do or do not need to do something with ultra processing or processing. To my view, I think we do not. We should focus at least on people with socioeconomic position, the inequities, and also the women. If we leave out the ultra processed food, who is doing the cooking? In some cases, of course, it's the women again. We need to look at the food environment for sure, and my advice to Carlos is to come up with a new NOVA to take these tweaks into account. In practice, dietetics, I think you should be aware of the traditional cuisine, and not all UPF are equally unhealthy. Additives in Europe are well regulated, and for sure we need to promote healthy diets. And the policymakers should continue to work with the multi-stakeholder approach, which includes industry. But to industry, I would like to say the public health interest is always much more important as the shareholder interest. But I know that within companies that may be a very difficult thing to uphold. But that is, of course, where we as communities play a role. And finally, of course, the politics should be involved, because I support policymakers, but if a policymaker has a good plan, it's not necessarily taken up in the politics and roll out in the community. And that is, I think, an important frustration of many of us. So in sum, I think the classification of foods into healthy and non-healthy, black and white, is quite difficult. It's the dose. But for sure, the current food-based dietary guidelines are still valid. I'd like to see healthy diet really as a point of entry, and we need to make these trade-offs of availability, acceptability, affordability, environmental impact and health impact. And finally, I hope we can tweak the NOVA to further underpin evidence-based guidelines and evidence-based policies. And finally, I didn't like this one in The Guardian last week, a ban on ultra-processed food. Again, don't throw away the baby to bathwater. I want to keep my whole grain bread. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edith. One of the points that you raised was around the big group of very heterogeneous foods that's included under the UPF classification. And a couple of questioners have asked about whether it'd be beneficial to subdivide that, to have other classifications within that, to separate out those foods which might be less desirable from those which have benefits. And you get the example of bread.
Yeah, I for sure think so. I think what I've seen in many countries, that the food-based dietary guidelines are carefully set up. There's a lot of science went into it. Also a lot of, let's say, science from communication point of view. So we need to align them. And if we, on one hand, in our wheel of 5 suggest that people should eat more whole grain bread, but on the other hand, ban it and say it cannot be bought in our bakery or my supermarket, well, we only have 1% of outlets, and at least everybody needs to, bake it themselves. Or indeed the bakery, we have bakeries, who do this, but then they have a lot of leftovers and a lot of food waste. So that is why I'm saying it's a trade-off, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's, completely black and white and ultra-processed food is nonsense. No, there are groups which you really don't need, like Carlos said, and that is clear, but they are nice to have. I must say in our wheel of 5, we also have, let's say, all the foods within the wheel of 5. And then there's also an option, and I like that a lot, of, let's say, a small list of foods like cookies or like sugar sweetened beverages, which you're advised to use maximum 1 time a week, right? Or 1 time a day, depending a little bit on the size and the content and the calories. And I think that is a much more viable approach, because when I look at the list of Nova 1, 2, and 3, I'm quite happy with it. But how do we do this in practice? This is, not convenient at all. And like I always joke, I don't want to go back to my grandmother's time with a cow in the garden and greens and vegetables and spending hours in the garden. So I think we have to be realistic there, especially since there is no scientific rationale for, let's say, banning my bakery bread and not banning my home baked bread. I think I love to have, a study which we compare them and just see whether this simple, addition of some of these emulsifiers or processing stuff really matters so much. It's difficult because we can look at eating rate, Kevin, or we can look at energy intake and maybe, something in the microbiota, of course, but we still don't know to what extent changes in the microbiota are really indicating a causal effect or a detrimental effect. Of course, everything you eat affects the microbiota to some extent. So then there is much to learn, but that would be my take on it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Edith. Carlos, I see you're now back. There was a question for you. We lost you for a few minutes, and so we didn't have a chance to ask the question. And it was about issues around equity. So many of these ultra-processed foods are relatively inexpensive. And if you shift away from these foods, are you going to penalize people who are less wealthy? I think you're muted, Carlos. If you could put your sound on, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question. I think this is very important point. But what about the evidence? I mean, if you take the US, if you see consumption of ultra-processed food on high, middle, and very low-income population, NHANES data, you see very small difference. You have 59% for the very poor, 57% for middle, and 55% for high-income people. So it's not just the poor people who are consuming ultra-processed food. Of course, there are people that don't have a minimum possibility to have a healthy diet, to buy fruits and vegetables, to have a more diversified diets, but this is an economic problem. So I think this we have to be very careful on this. So the fact that inequalities exist cannot be an excuse, to recognize that these more than 50% of energy intake of ultra-processed food is not acceptable and should be reversed. Of course, it would be easier for high-income people to adopt the not just the avoidance of ultra-processed food, but to have a diversified diet with legumes and fruits and vegetables. This really requires more money than poor people have. But I think that's the way I see. I'm very concerned with inequalities. My whole life, I work with this in mind. I study undernutrition for many years, and I'm still very committed with the problem of inequalities. But I think sometimes I see this as an argument to say, well, we have to live with ultra-processed food because, it's not just the poor people that are consuming ultra-processed food. This is a reality.
Maybe also it depends on the type of processed food, Carlos, because in the Netherlands we saw that ultra-processed foods on average is more costly than the mildly processed food. This is interesting. Yeah, I didn't show the slide, but yeah.
Yeah, it's really in Brazil, for instance, ultra-processed food is more expensive. We have a paper on this comparing UK. UK is cheaper, so it depends on the yeah.
Well, can I say we're running over time now, so I'm going to have to draw this to a close. So a huge thank you to all three of our speakers, Kevin Hall, Carlos Monteiro, and Edith Feskens. It's been a fantastic webinar, lots and lots of good ideas, some wonderful new research. Thank you all very much indeed. There are lots of questions in the chat which we've not had time to deal with.
Yeah.
And we could invite
Can I
the
ask,
speakers.
Can we answer them on some one way or another? If they are listed, I'm happy to answer by email or something. Or
yes, Jessie, can you address that one, please?
Yes, so we've received a lot of interesting questions. I think Bernadette has written somewhere in the chat, it's probably right at the top now already. We will be sending out the questions to you as well, and we hope that we can get some answers and then we can publish them on our website and also send them out to anybody who's participated in this webinar. Would be interesting.
And the whole webinar will be available to review if you'd like to go back over things. I think early next week. Is that the idea, Jessie?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all very much indeed, and have a good evening. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.